I'm one of the elders here at GBC, and I have the privilege of reading today's scripture, Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rebel and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Let us tear off their chains and free ourselves of their restraints. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord ridicules them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. I have consecrated my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will declare the Lord's decree. He said to me, "You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will shatter them like pottery. So now, kings, be wise. Receive instruction, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverential awe, and rejoice with trembling. Pay homage to the Son, or he will be angry, and you will perish in your rebellion. For his anger may ignite at any moment. All those who take refuge in him are happy."
Thanks, Joel. If you have a copy of the scriptures, I'd love for you to head to that passage that Joel just read for us. You'll find that writing named Psalms in the first portion of the scriptures called the Old Testament. And if you have a hard copy, if you open it up pretty much to the middle of it, you'll likely land in Psalms. If you miss it, you'll want to head a little bit to the left and you'll find it. Or you'll actually find Psalms about halfway through the table of contents in your hard copy or your device as you're looking for it. And what I want to do today is I want to use Psalm chapter 2 to launch us into a new series where we are living in a moment as a culture and as a society that feels a bit unique. In fact, at least in my lifetime, it feels like we're more polarized than we ever have been, where as a society, we are encouraging and stoking things like rage and anxiety as opposed to discouraging them or trying to calm them, which to me is just a little bit strange. I mean, could you imagine if we parented our kids that way? Like if I looked at my kids and I just stoked the flames of rage and anxiety in them every chance they got, like if the one of them was enraged and hauled off and hit their sibling or mouthed off to their mom, and I came to them and said, "Hey, great job. I'm mad too. They shouldn't have done that. That was the right thing to do. I'm enraged with you, and I just want you to remember that I was mad with you the next time I ask you to clean your room or take out the trash." That would go really badly for my family. It would go really badly for my marriage. The same thing with anxiety, and yet that's what we're seeing in our culture right now, where if you pay really close attention, it doesn't take you long to notice that we're looking at each other, especially people who are looking to gain power, and they're saying, "Are you angry about this? You enraged about this? I'm angry about it too. I'm enraged too." And I'll tell you what, if you let me get into a place of power and a place of authority and a place of influence, I promise you that I'll do something about what you're so angry about. Are you worried? You anxious? Are you worried about the economy? Are you anxious over this culture war issue? You should be, especially if those people get into power. And so what you need to do is you need to make sure that people like me and my tribe are the ones who get into the positions of power and influence. If you look, if you pay close attention, it doesn't take you long to notice that our culture right now is stoking these feelings of rage and anxiety to try and take advantage of them. And I'm just trying to sit here and say that this is even more acute because I don't know if you're aware of this. If you're like me, I don't know how you're not aware. You've gotten 7 million text messages. There's an election coming up in November. Everybody in our society right now is asking the question about who's going to get put into positions of power and authority at the local, state, and federal level. And I just, in this series, please don't ever mistake what I'm saying. I don't want you to ever hear me say that I don't think things like elections are important. I think they are important. I think they matter. And hear me very clearly. I think that we should participate in that process in every way that we possibly can. But at the same time, I'm looking at Christians like myself sometimes, and I'm starting to realize that we reflect more the world around us than the alternate world that we're supposed to reflect. Where we get so caught up in the rhetoric that's like, this is the most important election of our lifetime, which, by the way, so was 2 years ago. And so is 2 years before that, and 2 years before that, where it feels like the last 6 two-year election cycles have been the most important of our entire lifetime. And I'm just standing back and going, since when have we as Christians lived based on 2-year election cycles? Like, we live on the truth of who Jesus is as our King and His kingdom. And so what we're going to do in this series for the next 11 weeks is we're going to take the time as we head into this election season and focus our eyes on King Jesus and what He wants for us in His kingdom. To do that, what I want to do is lay the groundwork for that time with Psalm chapter 2. Everything we talk about today is going to be something that we talk about more over the coming weeks. So if we talk about something that you're thinking, I want to hear more, just make sure you keep coming back. Make sure if you can't be here that you stay caught up on the app or on our website. Or if you've got questions and you don't want to wait, come see me. Come talk to me, call me in the office, send me an email, and we can chat. So here's what I want to do. I want to lay the foundation here in Psalm 2 by showing us 3 really simple things in this psalm. The first of those is that we hate the idea of a king, which is a problem because the second thing we see in this psalm is that there is a king. And the third thing we see is that you and I desperately need that king. Let's look at Psalm 2 together and let's discover that you and I hate the idea of a king, which is a bit of a problem because there is a king who we desperately need. Let's start with the first of those things, the reality that we hate the idea of a king. The psalmist starts with this. He starts out in verse 1 talking about how we conspire and plot against the king. This is something that I think we see all over human history, that humanity just doesn't like the idea of a king. We don't like the idea of one person having all the authority, so much so that monarchy type of governments just don't really exist today. Anyone that's an actual king or queen really doesn't have that much power. And I think there's 2 reasons in our text for why we hate the idea of a king. One of them's implicit, the other's explicit. The implicit one is that we hate the idea of a king because we've never seen a perfect one. In fact, it's very rare that we've ever seen a good king throughout human history. Most of them are terrible. Most kings use their power and authority to wield it like a club over the people that they rule so that they can make their lives better and leave everybody else in the dust. And so we really don't like the idea of a king. That's why democratic models of government have taken root all over the world that spreads the power out from just one individual. We hate the idea of a king because we've never seen a perfect one and we've rarely seen a good one. But the second reason that we hate the king is, idea of a king at least, is explicit in our text. Look with me at verses 2 and 3. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and His anointed one. Let's tear off their chains and throw their ropes off of us. The second reason that you and I hate the idea of a king is because you and I don't like authority. Now, authority is something that we all experience in our lives. We all, no matter what our station is, have someone or something that is over us and has power over us. And if you and I are honest, we really don't like that. We'd much prefer that no one had authority over us but ourselves. We live with this anti-authoritarian type of mindset that gets stoked in our current moment that says that any authority is a bad thing. Any external authority outside of my own desires, my inner feelings, my inner wants, and my inner perspective on life is to be roundly rejected, because you and I believe in our heart of hearts that I'm the best one to determine what's good for me. I'm the best one to determine what my life is going to be like. I'm the best one to determine what's true and what's right. And you see this in some of the most famous phrases in our culture. Phrases like, you do you. Follow your heart. You live your truth. We despise the idea of authority. We don't like anyone telling us what to do. And so we hate the idea of a king, because that's what a king does, especially when you combine that with the reality that we've never seen a perfect king. But what's fascinating to me is that as much as you and I hate the idea of a king, we can't get away from it, can we? Think about it. Some of the most popular and, financially beneficial stories that we've seen in our culture revolve around the idea of a king, don't they? Like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, that series of books and the movies that were made on that have made millions and millions of dollars. And what's the plot line? a broken world that's in need of help, that's going to come from a king from the north who's going to save everybody. One of Disney's highest grossing movies financially in their history is a movie called The Lion King. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, you loved The Lion King. Like the animated film of The Lion King was one of the first ones that I went to see in the theater. And so that movie made millions in the 90s. And then what Disney did was they did what they've done with a lot of things. They made a live action remake of The Lion King that was exactly the same as the animated one in the 90s, and they made millions off of that one. And you know what the plot line of The Lion King is? The hopeful overthrow of the evil king Scar by the good and rightful king Simba, who would rule with justice, order, and mercy. What are our superhero movies except for kings and queens rising up to take power and save us all? See, we hate the idea of a king, but there's something in our hearts that won't let it go. There's something in our hearts that tells us that we need a perfect king to come in and save us all, which is why there's good news in Psalm chapter 2, because even though it names the fact that we hate the idea of a king, it shows us that there is a king. Not just any king, but there is a good and perfect king. We read in verse 2 that the kings of the earth rise up against God's anointed one. So it's commonly believed that this psalm became a coronation song in the history of the people of Israel. This was a song that would be sung as a new king was given the throne over his people. However, there are psalms like this one throughout the entire book that talk about earthly kings or earthly rulers in a way that it just can't be talking about a human being, because the language is too grand, it's too great, it's too magnificent, it's too wonderful, and this is one of those pictures. That word, translated anointed one, is literally the word for Messiah. It's the word that talked about the person that the Israelite people were expecting to come into the world, liberate God's people, establish them as his people, and bring God's kingdom into the world once and for all. And so the king being rebelled against here isn't an earthly king, it's a heavenly one. It's the anointed one, it's the Messiah, the greatest king of them all. And so the question you have to ask is, who is it? Who's the Messiah? Who's the anointed one? And we find the answer in a very famous story that we have recorded for us by one of Jesus' closest friends and followers that takes place at a well in a place called Samaria. And it's at this well that Jesus is having a conversation with a woman. And in part of their conversation in John chapter 4, it says this: "The woman said, 'I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us.' Then Jesus declared, 'I, the one speaking to you, am he.'" Jesus looks at this woman who is expecting the anointed one, expecting the Messiah to come and set all wrongs right and bring God's kingdom into the world. And he says, "That's me. I am he. I'm the anointed one that you've been waited for." Jesus is the king that we hate the idea of so much. You see this in God's response to our rebellion back in Psalm 2, where he says in verse 4, it says, "The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord ridicules them." It's like God looks at all of this conspiring and all of this rebellion, and he says, "Yeah, that's cute. Like all of that stuff that you're doing to conspire against me and to rebel against me, that's cute. It's hilarious." And then he goes on to say, then he speaks to them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. "I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain." It's not up for debate. God has his champion. The throne is occupied, and it is occupied by the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. God doubles down on this in verses 7 through 9. He says, "I will declare the Lord's decree. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with an iron scepter. You will shatter them like pottery.'" It's so important to realize that these words are being said by God the Father to God the Son, Jesus Christ. And we know that to be true because later in the New Testament, we have a writing called Hebrews where the author is trying to make the point that Jesus is greater than any angel that has ever existed. And the author quotes Psalm 2 to make their point when it says, "To which angel did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have become your Father. The Father is saying to Jesus that everything is yours. The nations will be your inheritance, and the ends of the earth will be your possession. There is a king, and his name is Jesus. Which is why, if you and I are willing to be honest with ourselves, we struggle so much with hating him. Because allow me to show you why. If Jesus is king, and the earth is his possession and everything in it, then that's actually true. Everything belongs to Jesus, including you and I. And what that means, really simply, is that he gets the authority. He gets to determine what's true. He gets to call the shots and tell us what we're going to do with our lives. We don't get to do that. And on top of all of that, he gets to take possession of what's his. Like what we're reading here is judgment language. And it's something that we're really uncomfortable with because it's revealing the fact that Jesus is going to come back to take possession of everything that is his. And see, we belong to Jesus. And if we don't recognize that, if we're not willing to submit to him as our king, to whom we belong, then we are going to get caught up when Jesus comes back and breaks his enemies and shatters them to pieces. I know this can be uncomfortable for us. It feels like a foreign and primitive idea of who God is, and yet right here we see it. What this psalm is saying is that we hate the God who is the king. We hate the God who says, you and the ends of the earth are my possession, because we feel like no one should have that kind of authority and that kind of power. So the question that this begs us to ask is, why Jesus? Why does Jesus get to be the king? And there's a lot of answers that I could give you for that. I'm just going to stick with two. The first reason Jesus gets to be king is because he's God. He's God. He's co-eternal with the Father and the Holy Spirit. He's that which none greater can be conceived. And by the way, I don't need to give you a reason beyond that, do I? Like if Jesus is, the reason Jesus is king is because he's God. End of conversation. But what's awesome is that there's more reasons than that. And another reason that Jesus gets to be king is because of what we've seen Jesus do with his authority, his power, and his rule. There's this awesome story from Jesus' ministry where, I kid you not, two of Jesus' disciples, which are the group of people that were his closest friends and followers, that's what the Gospels call them. They call them his disciples. Two of them ask their mom to go to Jesus and ask Jesus to give them the greatest positions of power in Jesus' kingdom. I'm not kidding you. Like, millennials weren't the first people who took their moms on job interviews, okay? Like, Jesus' disciples did it, so get off our backs, all right? Like, so they do this. They send their mom to ask Jesus, will you give my sons, because they're brothers, you can see the plan there. Like, can you give my sons the greatest positions of authority in your kingdom? And the rest of the disciples get really mad because they didn't think of it first. Like, they didn't think of asking Jesus for that first, and they're all mad because they believe that they deserve those positions of power and those positions of honor and authority in Jesus' kingdom, and they're all freaking out and arguing with each other, and Jesus gets them to calm down, and he says this to them in Matthew 20:25. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. Jesus says, you guys know how much you hate it when the people in authority over you lord that position and power over you the way that you do. We can resonate with that as 21st century Western readers of the Scriptures, right? We hate the same thing. And so Jesus says, listen, that's not how it works in my kingdom. Any power or authority you have is not used to be lorded over people. In my kingdom, we use power and authority to serve others. And then Jesus says this in Matthew 20, verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The King was here. Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, put on flesh and became 100% human. He was still 100% God at the same time, but he was also 100% human, the perfect example of who God made us to be. And he served us by going to a cross where he died for our rebellion, pictured in Psalm chapter 2. There's this wonderful scene that happens on the Sunday before Jesus dies, where he rides into the capital city of the Jewish people called Jerusalem, and he's given a king's welcome. As you read the story, you're supposed to be picturing the coronation ceremonies of the great kings of Israel of old. And the way you expect the story to end is that Jesus would be enthroned as king, that he would be sitting on a comfortable throne, resting his arms and feet on some cushions with a golden crown on his head. Only 5 days later, Jesus is enthroned, but it's on a throne of wood in the shape of a cross, to which he's fastened by nails through his hands and his feet, and instead of a crown of gold, he's wearing a crown of thorns. And in that moment, the King of the universe suffers immeasurably on our behalf, where he takes all of the punishment and all of the penalty that we were due for our rebellion against him as our king on himself and dies, so that on the third day he could rise again from the dead, conquer the power of sin and death on our behalf, and walk out of the grave as the victorious King of the universe. See, Jesus deserves to be king because the first time he came here, he didn't come in power and authority to rule. He came in humility to serve. This reason we struggle so much with hating the idea of a king is because I'm convinced we've never seen a king like Jesus. We've never seen a king who is perfect in holiness, righteousness, justice, love, and kindness. We've never seen a king willing to do for us what King Jesus has done for us. And so I would humbly submit to you today that because of what Jesus was willing to do for us, he is more than deserving of sitting on the throne that he occupies right now. And he's more than deserving of being the one who's going to come back and judge the living and the dead. I know we hate the idea of a king, especially the idea of a king that might use that power and the authority to judge. But the reason we hate it so much is because we've never seen a king who is as holy, gracious, kind, loving, and just as Jesus is. That's why, despite our hatred of the king that is, we desperately need him. We desperately need the king. Our psalm ends by describing to us how we should respond to Jesus as our king. We see that in Psalm chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. And one of the things that we're told there, it says, stop your rebellion. Be wise and take the warning that God is giving you. Stop living in your plots because you need the king. And the reason we need him so desperately is seen in verse 12, where we're told that our way will lead to us perishing in our rebellion. Another way that you could translate that is to say that our way will lead to our destruction. The psalmist is making the point that if we continue in our rebellion against the king, the only result will be destruction in our lives, not just now, but for all of eternity. And I think that's something that, if we're all honest, we've experienced. Can you think of a time like that in your life, where doing things your way, the way you wanted, caused destruction, not just for you, but for other people? I can think of several of those in mind. One of them, for example, was I was hanging out with a group of my friends, and I thought that because of the friendship I had built with them, I could treat them however I wanted. And so in a really stupid moment of selfishness, I looked at my friend and I called her something that I won't repeat now because there are kids in the room and I don't want to give them something to use against their siblings later on today. That would be really, really bad. But I called her this, and the result was destruction. Like, our relationship as friends was never the same because of how I offended her when I called her that. I did things my way. I followed my heart. I did me. I lived my truth. And all it did was cause destruction. You been there? Have you seen that in your own life? Like that's what the psalmist is trying to get at here. When you and I live out our truth the way we want to, it causes death and destruction, not just for people around us, but for us. And ultimately, that's what it's going to cause for us for all of eternity, because God will give us what we want. If we want to continue in rebellion against the King, He will give us that rebellion for all of eternity, completely separated from Him, left to our own devices in that kind of destruction. You know this. You've seen this in your own life. Doing things your way creates destruction. There are times where you feel like you can't even get out of your own way if you're anything like me. And that's why we desperately need the King. That's why we desperately need to turn to Him in our lives and give Him control. This is driven home in the last words of the psalm. Here's what it says: all who take refuge in Him are happy. Happy are those who take refuge in the King. That word happy is really interesting. It translates a word that has really deep meaning to it. It's a word that means being the most satisfied, the most fulfilled. It's a word that means flourishing, living life the way that it was meant to be lived, and taking refuge in the King. And the way that we believe we take refuge in the King in general, especially initially in our lives, is that we believe in Him. All throughout the Scriptures, from beginning to end, the way that we end our rebellion against the King and take refuge in Him is that we believe. We place all of our faith, all of our hope, and all of our trust in Him. Like, if I can just put it to you as simply as I can today, the way that you find the life that you've always desired is by refusing to continue rebelling against the King, by recognizing Him as such, by going to Him and saying, I'm not my own. I belong to you. You do what you want with my life. It's surrendering to Him and taking refuge in Him. And then we continue to take refuge in the King by taking some steps that I think we see in verses 10 through 12. I want to show you 3 ways that we can take refuge in the King in our relationship with Jesus. And the first one is this: we can take refuge in the King by submitting to Him. Verse 11 says, serve the Lord with reverential awe and rejoice with trembling. What it means to take refuge in the King is to serve Him, is to serve His will for our lives. What that means, in one sense, is that He's the one who gets to define what I'm going to do with my life. He gets to define what's true for me. He gets to define what and who I'm going to pursue. I'm not the one who gets to determine those things. Now, it's been my experience that a lot of us as Christians believe that we're really good at this. We think we do a pretty good job of submitting to Jesus. And the reason we think that is because we check a certain amount of boxes that we think are really important. So what we'll do if we're not careful is we'll say, I'm submitting well to Jesus because I'm submitting to what Jesus says about sex and about money and about human dignity and race, and like I'm submitting to all of these things, and so I'm good to go. When there are things left over in our lives that we aren't submitting to Him. So you might be sitting there and saying, I'm submitting well to Jesus because I've submitted to the Christian sexual ethic. I believe what Jesus teaches along those lines, and I try to practice that in my life. But at the same time, you believe that money is something for you to exploit for your own good and hoarded for your security, which means you're not submitting to what Jesus has to say about money. Like, you might be in a place, and I love you for it, where you've submitted to Jesus' thoughts on human dignity and how we as human beings are supposed to live together, but at the same time, you act as if your spouse exists to serve your needs and make your life better, which means you're not submitting to what Jesus has to say about your spouse. Like, I just want to encourage you today that I don't care how long you follow Jesus personally, if you take a hard look at your life, there are areas that you're not submitting to Him. Whether you haven't submitted it to Him yet, or at one point you did and you're just not doing it anymore. And the encouragement that I would give you today is to take refuge in the King by continually looking for those areas so that you can submit them to Jesus again. The second way we can take refuge in the King is by revering Him. In verse 11, there's this intriguing phrase that says, rejoice with trembling. That's what it means to revere the King, to stand in reverence before Jesus. So what's that like? What's it like to rejoice with trembling? I've had a few experiences like that in my life. One of them was recently I took my kids to John Ball Zoo, and we went to the brown bear exhibit, and it was really cool because that bear was right up against the glass. And it was awesome. This bear was beautiful. Like, I had never realized how big a brown bear is until I stood like on the other side of the glass. It was magnificent. It was wonderful. Like, I felt drawn to this bear until all of a sudden I caught a glimpse of its claws. And it opened its mouth, and I caught a glimpse of those teeth. And in that moment, there was this little twinge of, I'd call it fear, but I don't want to look like a wuss, so I'll just say that it was a twinge of, man, I'm really thankful that this glass is between the two of us. Because for all of the beauty and awe and majesty of that animal that was drawing me to it, there was a seriousness with which I needed to take it. That's what it looks like to revere the King, is to look at Jesus in all of his majesty, all of his glory, all of his splendor, and let yourself be drawn to him in that, while still being sober-minded about the seriousness of the person who is drawing you to himself. Brothers and sisters, if you haven't had an experience like that in your life recently, I would suggest you go home this afternoon and read a passage like Revelation 1, or Revelation chapter 19. If you haven't had one of those reverential awe moments with Jesus in a while, go read the story in Matthew 17 where Jesus is with 3 of his closest friends and he's transformed into the glory of all that he is, and watch how they respond. Take some time to stand in awe of the one who invites you to take refuge in him. And then lastly, taking refuge in the King looks like relying on him. If you want to take refuge in the King, you need to rely on him. There's this cool phrase in verse 12 that says, pay homage to the Son. If you read that in the original language, it literally says, kiss the Son. And it's a command. Like, the command in this text is to kiss the Son. Now, it's important to understand that in the ancient Near East, you would kiss the king as a way to show that you were relying on him. What you would normally do is you would kiss the ring that was on the king's finger, and in doing so, you were showing that you recognize the king as having the power and the authority to rule over you, and that in recognizing that, you were trusting that he was going to provide for you and keep you safe. And so that's what you and I need to do when it comes to Jesus. We need to make sure that we are relying on him as the one to provide all that we think we need in life. See, there's this reality in our lives that if we're not careful as human beings, we will enthrone all kinds of different stuff that we think is going to bring us the life that we desperately desire. And so we'll put things on the throne like money and power and influence and relationships when they can't sit on the throne. They're not made to give you the satisfaction that you desire. Please remember that come the fall. Neither Donald Trump or Kamala Harris are the answer. Neither of them are the king or the queen who is going to save us all. Like, these seasons in life will go a long way towards showing us how much we value comfort and safety and stability in our lives, and the things that we will enthrone that we think will bring that to us. And I'm just telling you that when you put anything on the throne of your life other than King Jesus, it can't do it for you. It cannot bring you all the things that you so desperately desire and think you need in your life. There is only one person, one king who can do that. And God has established him on his holy mountain and placed him on his holy throne. And his name is Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let's declare that truth together after I pray for us. Jesus, you are everything that we have talked about today. You are the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You are mighty. You are holy. You are awesome. You are more powerful than any of us can imagine. You are reigning and ruling right now in the midst of everything that is going on in our world and in our lives. And I pray that every single one of us listening to this today would give you the honor and the recognition that you're due for that reality in our lives. Would you help us to see that your goodness and your nature can help us overcome this hatred that we have in our sin for the idea of a king and a ruler? Would you help us to see your humility and your grace that invites us into a relationship with you that we can have that's unlike a relationship we could have with any other authority figure in our world and in our lives. I pray that you would invite us to take refuge in you. Show us the areas that we need to submit to you, whether that's coming to you in salvation through initial submission to you as our King or through continued submission as your followers. I pray that you would help us to revere you, that we would simply stand in awe and wonder of who you are and what you've done. And I pray that you would help us to recognize, Holy Spirit, the idols that we have placed on the throne in your place. In a world and a culture right now that is so focused on the system or the person that is going to save our society from all of its ills, may we remember that the only person who can do that is you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.